was the first Christian kingdom in the sea world. The German Gospels in Ethiopia, believed to be the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts. It's a text written in Giz, an ancient language of Ethiopia. What if the most important chapter in human history was never lost? Just never. Read, for 16 centuries in the mountains of Ethiopia, monks guarded ancient texts attributed to Jesus himself, teachings said to have been spoken during the 40 days after the resurrection, words never translated, never circulated, and never absorbed into Western Christianity. Why were these teachings preserved in silence, and who decided the world wasn't ready to hear them? While Europe built cathedrals, fought crusades, and defined orthodoxy, Ethiopia safeguarded an older, broader version of the faith, one that included entire books the West discarded, priests and lay worshippers. In Ethiopia are on a mission, centuries, old religious manuscripts and sacred artwork in efforts to preserve traditions and heritage. And if that history was always there waiting, what does it mean for everything we think we know today? Now in 2025, these writings are finally reaching a wider audience. And what they reveal doesn't dismantle the resurrection, it transforms it, challenging who shaped Christianity's story, who was excluded from it, and why. This chapter remained unread until now. The manuscript that changes everything. Let me take you to a place most people will never see, high in the Ethiopian highlands, where the air is thin and the silence is ancient. There are monasteries carved into cliff faces. Inside these stone walls, the Tray region in northern Ethiopia is known for its assembly of rock-hewn churches. There's only one way up. You have to climb this cliff face. Monks have spent centuries copying texts. By candlelight, they rise before dawn. They fast, they pray, and they guard manuscripts that the outside world forgot existed. One of these manuscripts is called the Mashafa Kadan, which translates to the Book of the Covenant. It is written in Ge'ez, the classical, liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Ge'ez is not like Greek or Latin. It carries layers of symbolism, poetic, theology and spiritual meaning that cannot simply be decoded like mathematics. For this reason, Western scholars largely ignored it. They focused on the languages they knew, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and assumed that if anything important existed, greater than a holy book, more than 1,000 years old, viewed as the oldest and most complete Hebrew Bible, it would have been translated long ago. They were wrong. The Mashafa Kadan contains something extraordinary. It preserves teachings attributed to Jesus during the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. In the Western tradition, those 40 days are almost empty. The Gospels mention that Jesus appeared to his followers, showed them his wounds, ate fish, and then ascended into heaven. That is essentially the entire story. But the Ethiopian text tells a different version. In this version, the risen Jesus does not simply prove he is alive. He teaches, he instructs, he reveals practices and visions and spiritual truths. Jesus has been raised from the dead. Truly, then God's judgment has fallen on all, the powers of cruelty and tyranny and hatred that contributed to his death, that were never recorded in the texts, that became the Western Bible. One passage from the newly translated text reads, "You ask for proof, but I give you perception. You seek signs, but I give you stillness." Think about that for a moment. This is not the Jesus of public sermons and crowded hillsides. This is Jesus as a mystic guide teaching his closest followers how to see the world differently after resurrection. The text speaks of the soul becoming light. It speaks of grief transforming into understanding. It describes resurrection not as a single miraculous event, but as a process of awakening that anyone can undergo if they follow a certain path of devotion. Another line from the text states, "You will see not with eyes closed by fear, but with hearts opened by wonder. This language is not doctrinal. It is not about believing the kustumir, right things, or following the right rules. It is about transformation. It is about becoming something new. And this emphasis on inner change rather than external proof is radically different from how the resurrection has been presented in Western Christianity for the past 17 centuries. Now I need to be very clear about something. This is not a sensational secret gospel in the style of conspiracy theories. The Mashafa Kadan is a serious sacred text that has been part of Ethiopian Orthodox tradition for over a millennium. Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been around for centuries with a vast religious, cultural, and political influence. Ethiopian monks have been reading it, studying it, and living by its teachings for generations. The only thing that was secret about it was that nobody in the West bothered to translate it. The text was not hidden from us. We simply never looked, and that raises an uncomfortable question. If teachings this significant were sitting in Ethiopian monasteries the entire time, what else have we missed? What else did we assume did not matter because it was not written in the text? Languages we privileged, preserved by the cultures we valued? The answer, as it turns out, is quite a lot. But before we get to the other texts, Ethiopia preserved, we need to understand how Ethiopia became Christian in the first place, because that story challenges another assumption most people carry without realizing it. The assumption that Christianity spread from west to east, from Rome outward to the rest of the world, the kingdom that believed before Rome. Here is a fact that will reframe everything you think you know about Christian history. Ethiopia became an officially Christian nation at least 50 years before Rome did. In the early 4th century, around 330 CE, King Ezana of the Kingdom of Aksum declared Christianity the official state religion. This was decades before Emperor Constantine made Christianity the faith of the Roman Empire in 380 CE. Let that sink in. While Rome was still debating, while the great councils were still forming, while the creeds that would define Western Christianity were still being written, Ethiopia had already committed. An African kingdom embraced Jesus before Europe did. And here is what makes this even more significant. Ethiopian Christianity did not come from Rome. It developed independently. The faith spread through local engagement, personal devotion, and the influence of missionaries like Frumentius, who is remembered in Ethiopian tradition as the first bishop of Aksum. There were no imperial decrees forcing conversion. There were no armies carrying crosses alongside swords. The faith grew, as one Ethiopian monk described it, not on the back of Antisuki empire, but from the hearts of the Shomitim people. Because Ethiopian Christianity developed outside Roman influence, it created its own liturgical rhythms, its own theological vocabulary, and its own scriptural traditions shaped by local context and ancient languages. While Rome was holding councils to decide which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia was quietly preserving texts that those councils rejected. Ethiopian capital priests and lay people work hand in hand to replicate sometimes centuries-old religious manuscripts and sacred artwork. While Constantinople and Rome were locked in political and theological struggles over authority and doctrine, Ethiopian monks were climbing mountains to build monasteries where they could pray in peace and copy manuscripts that would survive for 16 centuries. The Ethiopian church asked different questions than the Roman church. Rome asked, "How do we unify belief under central authority?" Ethiopia asked, "How do we encounter the sacred directly?" That single difference shaped two completely distinct forms of Christianity. Rome built councils, creeds, and hierarchies. Ethiopia built rituals, practices, and a mystical tradition based on experience rather than authority. In Rome, Christianity became organized. In Ethiopia, Christianity became embodied, lived out through fasting that lasts over 200 days per year, through sunrise prayers, through chants that echo across mountain valleys, through a relationship with the divine that is immediate and personal. One Ethiopian priest put it this way: "The church is not made of stone. It is made of breath, fire and water like creation itself." That is not metaphor. That is lived theology. And it explains why Ethiopian Christianity preserved texts that the Western tradition discarded. When your faith is built on direct experience rather than centralized control, you do not need to throw away books that challenge authority. You need books that deepen experience. And the books Ethiopia kept are extraordinary. Before we explore those books, I want to show you something remarkable. Proof that Ethiopian Christianity was not some minor offshoot, but a sophisticated, literate, artistically rich tradition that predates most of what we call Western Christian civilization. I'm talking about the Gara Gospels, the oldest Christian books on earth. In a monastery called Abagarima, located in the Ethiopian highlands, there are illustrated gospel books that have been dated by radiocarbon analysis to between 390 and 570 CE. That makes them among the oldest Christian manuscripts in existence. This is the Ethiopian Jerma Gospels, a complete handwritten copy of the four Gospels, dated as early as 330 AD. They may be older than any complete Gospel book from Europe. While much of Europe was entering what historians call the Dark Ages, while the Roman Empire was collapsing and tribal warfare was consuming the continent, Ethiopian scribes were creating full Gospel manuscripts with theological clarity and artistic vision. The Jerma Gospels are not just texts, they are art. The pages are made of goatskin, carefully prepared, and dyed with natural pigments. The illustrations show the Gospel narrative in a style unique to Ethiopian Christianity, with imagery and symbolism that developed independently from Byzantine or Roman artistic traditions. These books were not made for power or display. They were made for devotion, for meditation, for beauty. One monk from the Gara monastery wrote, "To draw is to pray with the hand what the mouth cannot say." What the Gimma Gospels prove is that Christianity did not spread in a straight line from Jerusalem to Rome to everywhere else. It blossomed in parallel. Multiple Christian cultures were developing simultaneously, each with their own languages, their own art, their own understanding of the faith. The Ethiopian church was not waiting for Roman approval or Byzantine instruction. It was creating a Christian identity rooted in its own traditions, its own saints, its own sacred geography. And as scholars have begun to digitize and preserve the Jerma Gospels, they are discovering connections between these ancient illuminated books and teachings that were erased or ignored in the Western canon. Which brings us to the most provocative question of all. What else did Ethiopia preserve that the West left behind? The answer is the entire book. Books that were once considered sacred by early Christians. Books that shaped Jewish thought in the centuries before Jesus. Books that were removed from Western Bibles, but remained core scripture in Ethiopia for 1,600 years. The books the West threw away. When the Bible was being assembled in the 4th and 5th centuries, church leaders had to make decisions. Which books would be included? Which books would be left out? In the West, that process was as political as it was spiritual. Councils met, debates raged, compromises were made, and certain texts were rejected, sometimes because they were considered too mystical, too complex, or too difficult to control. Ethiopia made different choices, and the books they kept are fascinating. Most notably, the Ethiopian Bible includes 1 Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, not as footnotes or appendices, but as core scripture. These are not obscure texts. 1 Enoch was hugely influential in early Christianity. The Book of Enoch is a compilation of a number of writings that most likely existed independently, but eventually got pulled together in one document. The New Testament letter of Jude directly quotes from it. Early church fathers referenced it extensively. It speaks of angels, visions, cosmic justice, and the coming of a messianic figure. It shaped how early Christians understood prophecy, resurrection, and the end times. But Western church leaders decided it was too mystical, too hard to reconcile with the doctrine they were building, so they removed it. Jubilees retells the book of Genesis with a sacred calendar and spiritual structure. It provides context for understanding Jewish law, cosmology, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. Like Worst Enoch, it was widely read in the centuries before and after Jesus. And like First Enoch, it was excluded from Western Bibles. But Ethiopia kept both. Ethiopian Christians have been reading these texts continuously for over 16 centuries. The Ethiopian texts matched. Ethiopia had not altered these books. Ethiopia had preserved them with remarkable fidelity, while the West had forgotten they ever existed. Think about what this means. For centuries, scholars studied Christianity using an incomplete set of texts. They built theologies, wrote dissertations, and argued about doctrine based on a Bible that was missing entire books. Meanwhile, the complete versions were sitting in Ethiopian monasteries waiting to be rediscovered. The arrogance of assuming that nothing important could exist outside the Western tradition, outside the languages we privileged, outside the cultures we centered. That arrogance cost us centuries of insight. And now we circle back to where we started, the Mashafaka Kadan, the resurrection teachings, because these newly translated texts do not stand alone. They are part of an entire tradition of Ethiopian Christianity that preserved mystical, transformative, experience-based spirituality while the West was building institutions. And those teachings offer something that many people today are desperately seeking: resurrection as awakening. In Western Christianity, the resurrection is primarily treated as a historical event. Jesus died. Jesus rose. The tomb was empty. Believe it or do not. The emphasis is on the miracle as proof. Evidence that Jesus was who he claimed to be. Validation of Christian theology. But the Ethiopian texts present something different. They present resurrection not just as an event, but as a process. Not just as something that happened to Jesus, but as something that can happen to anyone who follows the path he taught. According to these teachings, the 40 days after the resurrection were not empty time. They were the most important teaching period of Jesus' ministry. During those 40 days, he instructed his closest followers in practices of transformation. He taught them how to see differently, how to perceive reality with spiritual depth, rather than just physical sight. He spoke of the body becoming a vessel of light. He described how perception shifts through silence, through posture, through elements like sunlight and wind and fasting. One line from the text reads, "Those who walk after the sun but never see its light have not yet risen." This reframes everything. Resurrection is not just a miracle that proves Jesus was divine. It is an invitation. It is a path. It is something you can participate in, not something you simply accept or reject. Salvation becomes less about belief and more about becoming. Not a moment of being saved, but a lifelong process of learning to see, to perceive, to transform. The Greek word for resurrection, anastasis, literally means to stand up, to rise, to awaken. The Ethiopian texts take that meaning seriously. They present resurrection as a form of spiritual awakening available to anyone willing to do the work. This is why these teachings did not fit the structured theology that emerged after the Council of Nika in 325 CE. That council was about defining doctrine, establishing what Christians must believe to be considered orthodox. It was about unity and authority and clear lines between right belief and wrong belief, but teachings about inner transformation, about direct spiritual experience, about practices that change perception, those do not fit neatly into creeds. They are too personal, too experiential, too hard to control, so they were left out of the Western tradition, not because they were heretical, but because they were inconvenient, and yet they survived. For 16 centuries, Ethiopian monks kept these teachings alive. They practiced the fasting, the prayers, the silence. They embodied what the texts described. And now, as these teachings finally reach a wider audience, they speak to something many people today are looking for. Why this matters now? Something strange is happening across the Western world right now. And the numbers tell a story that religious institutions do not want to hear. Churches are emptying. Pews that were filled for generations now sit vacant. Young people are walking away from organized religion faster than any generation before them. But here is what makes this moment different from simple secularization, from people just giving up on faith entirely. The data reveals something unexpected. People are not leaving because they stopped believing. They are leaving because they started wanting more. Survey after survey shows the same pattern. Those who leave institutional religion still describe themselves as spiritual. They still pray. They still seek meaning. They still feel that pull towards something greater than themselves. What they have rejected is not God. What they have rejected is the transaction. The formula, the idea that faith means showing up on Sunday, reciting the right words, checking the right boxes, and calling it done. They want experience over doctrine, mystery over certainty, transformation over membership. They are hungry for something that actually changes them, something they can feel in their bones, not just agree to in their heads. And into that hunger, into that ache for something deeper, the Ethiopian tradition speaks with a voice that feels almost prophetic. Thea sits at a triple junction between three tectonic plates. These ancient texts that have been preserved for 16 centuries, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Mashafakan, they do not just offer beliefs to accept. They offer practices to embody, silence as a doorway, fasting as a discipline that opens perception, sacred breath as a connection to the divine. The elements themselves, water and fire and sunlight and wind, treated not as metaphors, but as genuine encounters with the holy. This is the same language being used today in meditation retreats and wellness centers around the world. Millions of people are paying thousands of dollars to learn techniques of stillness, presence, and mindful awareness that Ethiopian monks have been practicing for free in mountain monasteries since the 4th century. The difference is that the modern wellness industry has stripped these practices of their sacred context. Mindfulness has been divorced from meaning. Meditation has been separated from the divine. People learn to breathe, but not to pray. They learn to be present, but not to encounter presence itself. The Ethiopian tradition never made that separation. The practices were always connected to transformation, to resurrection, to becoming something new through direct experience of the sacred. One theologian recently made an observation that stopped me cold. He said, "The future of faith will look more like Ethiopia's past." Think about what that means. The thing that spiritual seekers today are desperately looking for, that raw, unmediated, transformative encounter with something greater. It already exists. It has existed for over 1,600 years. It was just preserved in a language most people could not read, in monasteries most people would never visit, in a tradition that the dominant powers of history chose to overlook. The Ethiopian path is not rigid or dogmatic. It is rhythmic. It is visionary. It is embodied in daily practice rather than weekly attendance. It offers space for beauty, for stillness, for the kind of direct encounter that modern seekers crave. And here is what strikes me most deeply about these teachings. They do not ask the question that Western Christianity has obsessed over for centuries. They do not ask, "What do you believe?" Instead, they ask something far more challenging. How do you see that shift from belief to perception, from doctrine to experience, from mental agreement to lived transformation? That shift is everything. For the person who has given up on church but not on God. For the seeker who wants to feel something real and not just recite something true. For anyone who has ever sensed that there must be more to the story than what they were told. These ancient texts offer an answer. Not a new invention, not a modern compromise, but an ancient path that was never lost, just unread until now. So, what does all of this change? It changes the map of Christian history itself. The story doesn't move in a straight line from Jerusalem to Rome to the modern world. It branches, diverges, and survives in places the West learned to ignore. Ethiopia didn't lose the early tradition. It carried it forward intact, while other versions were narrowed, edited, and declared final. It changes how we see the Bible, not as a single untouchable monument, but as a living record shaped by human decisions where some voices were amplified and others quietly set aside. And it changes how we understand the resurrection, not merely as an event to believe in, but as a transformation meant to be lived. The Ethiopian texts suggest that in his final 40 days, Jesus was not demanding faith in his divinity, but teaching his followers how to awaken to something new. These manuscripts were guarded for 16 centuries, copied by hand, protected through war, famine, and empire. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were powerful. Now they are no longer hidden. The translations exist. The words are out in the open, which means the story isn't ending here. It's just reaching the point where it can no longer be ignored. The question is no longer whether these teachings are real. The question is, what happens now that we've finally heard?